It was a mild night in late May when Steve Boris and his date Jeanette Kuro walked into Melita's restaurant in South Philadelphia. Seated at the table at the far end of the Greek restaurant was Raymond Long John Morturano, a veteran Philadelphia mobster. They greeted each other warmly and sat down for an evening meal. It seemed like an ordinary catch-up amongst friends. However, partway through the night, they were unexpectedly interrupted. Two gunmen burst through the door and approached the table. They stopped and motioned for Morturano to step aside. As he did, the gunmen opened fire at Boris. Several shots were fired, and the assailants calmly walked out of the restaurant. It was the end of Steve Boros, leader of the Greek mob in Philadelphia. His date Janet Kuro was also shot dead in the hail of bullets. The incident would be the first of many violent acts ordered by the new crime boss of Philadelphia, little Nicky Scarfo. Boris was killed because he refused to pay Scarfo's street tax. Scarfo's new rule meant that anyone running an illegal business in Philadelphia would have to pay a certain percentage of their profits to Scarfo. The killing set an example to those who were thinking about ignoring the new rules. The murder of Boros and his date, however, didn't seem to deter an ambitious drug dealer named Johnny Calabrese, who, like Boris, refused to pay the street tax. Once again, without hesitation, Scarfo made the sign of the gun, symbolizing that Calabrese had to go. He was set up by a Scarfo lieutenant named Chicky Ciangalini. As Ciangalini walked Calabrese to his car after dinner at Cuz restaurant, a gunman approached from behind and shot Calabrese dead. It was clear that Scarfo's time as boss would be a bloody one. The Philadelphia underworld would be rocked by the slayings. The word was out, pay Nicky Scarfo what you owe, or it's this. Christmas 1981 would mark a break in the violence. Little Nicky Scarfo decided it was time for a celebration and arranged a festive party inviting all of the Philadelphia family. Later in the night, Scarfo signaled for Salvi. Salvatore Salvi Testa was the son of the former boss of the Philadelphia family, Philip the Chicken Man Testa, who was killed after a bomb was planted on the porch of his house earlier in the year. Salvi, Scarfo said, your father. It's time, he said, looking straight into Salvi's eyes. Salvi knew what this meant. It was time to avenge the death of his father. It's two guys. One is over there, as Scarfo motioned towards a figure standing at the bar. It was Frank Chicky Narducci. And the other guy is that Marinucci kid. Salvi had tears in his eyes. Scarfo kissed him on the cheek. Thank you, Nick, Salvi said. The young Turk was overwhelmed with emotions as he got up and left. It was the signal he'd been waiting for, ever since he learned of the news of his father's death. Now Chicky Narducci and Rocco Marinucci didn't know that Pete Casella had given them up when the Chin asked him to name his co-conspirators on the Phil Testa hit. The only story circling was that Casella had been banished to Florida, and Scarfo was the new boss. Only Scarfo, Chucky Merlino, and Philip Leonetti knew that Casella had given up Narducci and Marinucci. One evening, Narducci returned home and parked up his Cadillac. As the mobster got out and looked up, he saw death itself looking at him straight in the eye. It was the barrel of a gun, and behind it stood a man with nothing other than revenge on his mind. It was the Grim Reaper himself, Salvatore Salvi Testa. Hi, Frank, Salvi said, taking a second to absorb the look of horror on his victim's face. Squeezing the trigger in rapid succession, he blasted Narducci in the face several times at point-blank range. Narducci's body crumpled to the ground where Testa and Joe Pungiatori emptied their guns on the multi-millionaire captain. Narducci had been shot 10 times in the head, neck, and body. He lay dead, wedged between his car and the curb. It was the end of the power-hungry Frank "Chicky" Narducci. Revenge had been served, and it had been done in typical Philadelphian street fashion. Rocco Marinucci, the bomber in the Testa hit, was next on Salvi's list. Marinucci was unaware that he was on Scarfo's hit list, as Salvi's crew had been using him on burglary jobs. This gave the 38-year-old pizza shop owner reassurance that all was okay. He was wrong. Marinucci was lured to the Buckeye Club on the ruse of a burglary job that needed planning. As he walked into the club, the lights were out. Marinucci pulled another light string, and as the lights came on, he saw the barrel of a gun. And behind that barrel stood death once again. It was Salvi Testa. They tied Marinucci up and tortured him for several hours. They jammed firecrackers in his mouth, but the saliva from Marinucci's mouth would prevent them from exploding. Finally, Salvi put the ambitious 38-year-old burglar out of his misery and shot him several times in the head. They left the firecrackers in his mouth as a message that this was payback for the Testa hit. Marinucci was deliberately murdered a year to the day that Philip Testa was killed. It was the end of Rocco Marinucci, and Salvi's revenge had been served up in devilish fashion. In 1982, Scarfo was having serious problems with an old-time Sicilian-born mobster. He balked at paying the street tax that Scarfo was demanding. For years, he'd operated a crew without paying any street tax to the bosses, but occasionally giving them a taste of his action. He thought after Scarfo took over that he could continue the same arrangement. The Sicilian-born gangster went back in the Philadelphia mob as far as Salvatore Salvi, one of the first mob bosses of the city, and was reportedly the youngest man to be made in La Cosa Nostra at the age of 17. The man ran a competent crew of gangsters that reported only to him. If one was to look at his appearances, they wouldn't think much. Standing at a mere 5'1", weighing 136 pounds, with a high-pitched voice, he didn't look like anything to be reckoned with. It was Harry the Hunchback Riccobene. In reference to Riccobene, once again, Scarfo made the sign of the gun. He dispatched Frank Monte, the family's consigliere, to try and persuade Riccobene's half-brother, Sonny, to set up the hunchback. The plan backfired. Sonny informed the hunchback of the plot. A few weeks later, Riccobene sent a message of his own. Riccobene gunmen found Frank Monte at a gas station, and he was shot several times whilst standing in front of his car. The gunman fled the scene, leaving the family consigliere lying in a pool of blood. It was the end of Frank Monte. The war had begun, and the Riccobene faction had drawn first blood. When Scarfo heard the news, he was incensed. A few days later, the hunchback stepped into a phone booth to make a call. After a few minutes, he noticed a scruffy-looking man walking hastily towards him. As the man drew closer, he pulled out a revolver and started firing at the hunchback. The hunchback stormed out of the booth and ran towards the gunman. He managed to wrestle the gun from the assailant and started squeezing the trigger, but the revolver was out of bullets. The gunman fled the scene. A short time later, police found the hunchback alive and leaning against the booth, bloodied and holding the attacker's weapon. The gunman was Salvatore Wayne Grande, one of Scarfo's soldiers. Despite being shot 5 times, the hunchback survived the attack. In late July, Riccobene gunmen spotted Salvi Testa in the market eating clams in the 9th Street Italian market. The gunman opened fire, and Testa was hit with a shotgun blast to the shoulder. The tough young gangster survived the attack and bounced back after a few weeks to continue the hunt for Riccobene's men. Shortly after the incident, Scarfo hitmen caught sight of the hunchback sitting in his Mercedes. They opened fire, but because of his small stature, the hunchback was able to take cover under the dash. Once again, miraculously, he survived, this time without being hit. In August 1982, Scarfo was jailed for 18 months on gun possession. Later on in December, the hunchback was jailed after being caught in possession of a firearm whilst on parole for a series of racketeering charges. Both leaders would be confined to coordinating the war behind bars. Riccobene soldier Sammy Tamborino was the next casualty. He was killed in his southwest Philadelphia headquarters. In direct contradiction to the rules of La Cosa Nostra, Tamborino was gunned down in front of his mother, who stood there helpless. Scarfo was over the moon when he learnt of the news. Later, Scarfo gunmen tracked down the hunchback's brother, Robert Bobby Riccobene. After stalking him for the whole day, Scarfo gunmen made their move. As Riccobene and his elderly mother exited their car, Scarfo soldier Fafi Iannarella approached Bobby Riccobene. When Riccobene saw Fafi, he took off attempting to jump a nearby fence to evade the pursuers. His plan failed. As the second in command of the Riccobene faction tried to climb over the fence, Fafi hit him with a shotgun blast to the head, and he fell to the ground. He lay on the ground lifeless. It was the end of Bobby Riccobene. As Fafi made his escape to a waiting getaway car, Riccobene's elderly mother tried to wrestle the shotgun from him. She was hit with the butt of the gun and fell to the floor. Fafi and the other gunmen fled the scene. Sitting in his jail cell, Scarfo was ecstatic at reading the news in the Philadelphia Inquirer. Leonetti would later recall, "My uncle used to talk to me in code when I'd visit him in prison. When he was happy with the news, he'd say, 'How about the Eagles? They're playing terrific, aren't they?' Which would mean he was happy with our progress in the war with the Riccobenes. If he wasn't happy, he'd say, 'How about them fucking Eagles? The whole team is lousy from top to bottom. They need to get rid of everybody and start over.' Which would mean he was disgusted that we weren't doing our jobs. On this occasion, the Eagles were definitely on point. It seemed like the Scarfo faction was winning the war with the Riccobenes, and they had almost capitulated. They were wrong. A few days later, Salvi Testa, his best friend Joey Pungiatori, and the Milano brothers, Gino and Nicky Whip, were in a car in South Philadelphia. Their car became boxed in by another vehicle, and 4 Riccobene gunmen opened fire. After the smoke cleared, the Scarfo crew members emerged. Luckily for them, no one was injured. But it would mark the last attack from the Riccobene faction. A few days later, Leonetti, Salvi, and Lawrence Merlino were at Jewelers Row in Philadelphia. Leonetti was looking for a watch for his girlfriend, as it was coming up to Christmas. As they were leaving the store, they passed by a jeweler's that was run by Sonny Riccobene's son, Enrico. The doors were usually locked and customers had to be buzzed in. When Leonetti and Salvi tapped on the window, Enrico approached the door, but when he saw who it was, he ran to the back of the store. A few seconds later, out of sheer panic and fear, he picked up a loaded gun and shot himself in the head. He died at the scene. It was the end of Enrico Riccobene. On learning that his nephew was the latest victim of the war, the hunchback's heart was broken. Things had gone too far and he'd had enough. At the start of 1984, the hunchback sent word that he was surrendering. The bloodiest war in the history of the Philadelphia underworld was over, and Scarfo had emerged as the winner. He now had control over all of Riccobene's lucrative operations. The Eagles had won the championship. A short time after Leonetti broke the news to Scarfo during a prison visit, that Salvi and Chucky Merlino's daughter, Maria, were engaged to be married. There was silence over the phone. I knew what my uncle was thinking. His radar was up. What if this was a play for Salvi to consolidate his power? He was already a rising star in the family. His leading capo and his underboss's daughter being married spelt danger for the paranoid Scarfo. However, his fears would be short-lived. Salvi called off the engagement a short while after. Scarfo was over the moon, and in Machiavellian fashion he would use this to his advantage. Salvi had asked permission from Scarfo to break up the relationship, and the paranoid Scarfo had given Salvi his blessing. "Don't worry, when I get out, I'll straighten everything out with Chucky," Scarfo reassured his worried young captain. However, at the same time, Scarfo told Chucky that Salvi had shown total disrespect by breaking off the engagement with his daughter. Chucky Merlino's and Salvi Testa's relationship was irrevocably shattered. Scarfo's political chicanery was in full swing. After his release from jail in 1984, Scarfo held a meeting with top members of his organization. After discussing a series of family matters with his underboss, Chucky Merlino, he added, "What about Salvi?" Leonetti recalled, "When I heard those words, I felt sick inside. I knew what my uncle meant when he said it. It was his way of saying, we've got to get rid of this guy." To add fuel to the fire, an article was published not too long after in the Wall Street Journal, which referred to Salvi as the fastest rising mobster in the United States. This pissed my uncle off to no end, Leonetti later recalled. He would say things like, "This kid is getting too big for his britches," or "This kid is acting like he wants to be the boss. We'll see about that," or "These ciggies are all up to something." As the summer of 1984 came around, Salvi Testa was on borrowed time. Chucky Merlino had backed Scarfo's play and had dispatched a hit squad to whack out the charismatic street boss of the Philadelphia crime family, Salvi Testa. Salvi sensed things were off and stopped hanging around the usual spots. He wouldn't be an easy target. He was a killer himself and knew all the street moves. There were even plans to whack Salvi at a wake for Joe Pungiatore's aunt, but the plan was aborted last minute. Later on at the wake, Chucky Merlino would say goodbye to Salvi with a kiss on the lips. It was the dreaded kiss of death. After so many attempts to get Salvi, Scarfo was growing impatient. They then decided to give the contract to Salvi's best friend, Joey Pungiatore. Pungiatore hesitantly agreed, but on the condition that he didn't pull the trigger. A meeting was set up with Salvi Testa at a candy store on Passyunk Avenue. It was the Grande brothers and Salvi's best friend, Joe Pungiatore. As Salvi arrived, he stepped into the store, and as he did so, Wayne Grande stepped out and shot Salvi in the back of the head. And as Salvi lay on the floor mortally wounded, Grande pumped another shot into the young and charismatic Salvi Testa. The corpse would later be loaded into a van and dumped at the side of a road along a wooded area 20 minutes outside of South Philadelphia. It was the end of Salvi Testa, and it would mark the beginning of little Nicky's downfall. Shortly after, Chucky Merlino, Scarfo's longtime friend and lieutenant, was demoted because of his drinking habits. Scarfo was disgusted at the behavior of his underboss and decided to demote him to a soldier. He promoted his trusted nephew Philip Leonetti to underboss. The move was rubber-stamped by Genovese emissary and consigliere Bobby Manna. In November 1986, a chain of events would begin the epic downfall of the Philadelphia mob under Nicky Scarfo. Top members of the Scarfo crew were charged with racketeering, narcotics, money laundering, and bookmaking. The case was based on taped conversations of Tommy Del Giorno, a longtime Scarfo crew member, discussing mob business. After Del Giorno found out about the recorded tapes, he agreed to cooperate with the FBI. He knew that once Scarfo found out about the tapes, Scarfo would make the sign of the gun. Del Giorno was the first made guy in the Scarfo crew to flip, but he wouldn't be the last. 3 days later, another made member, Nick The Crow Caramandi, also agreed to testify after being caught on a wiretap trying to extort a real estate developer. The man Nick The Crow was trying to extort was an undercover FBI agent. After a short holiday in Florida, the 57-year-old mob godfather stepped off his Air Brit flight from Fort Lauderdale. As soon as his feet touched the ground, he was surrounded by several FBI agents and promptly taken into custody. Months later, his nephew Philip Leonetti was also arrested. The FBI had rounded up most of Scarfo's crew. They faced serious indictments, including narcotics, racketeering, bookmaking, and murder. They were found guilty, and the sentences ranged from 35 years to life imprisonment. The bloodthirsty godfather of Philadelphia, Nicky Scarfo, was given 55 years and 14 years for the extortion case, plus a life without parole for the murder of Frankie Flowers D Alfonso. However, the final nail in the coffin for Scarfo was when he learnt that his nephew and trusted right-hand man, Philip Crazy Phil Leonetti, decided to flip and was cooperating with the FBI. In October 1990, the commission sent word to Nicky Scarfo that he was no longer the boss of Philadelphia and that John Stanfa would replace him as leader of the Philadelphia family. It was all over. It was the end of one of the bloodiest reigns in La Cosa Nostra. Little Nicky Scarfo had left a path of devastation behind him. In stark contrast to the leaders of the Philadelphia underworld before him, Scarfo would leave a trail of bodies, and it would eventually lead to his downfall. This was the real mob story of Little Nicky Scarfo.